really weird that libertarians can't tell you what they mean by liberty, or that they come up with something just off the cuff and then there's I just mean property or some, and they want to change the subject. I said an analogy would be as if you asked a utilitarian what utility was, and he said, "Look, I don't want to talk about that. Just look at the consequences. Consequences for utility. Yes. So what's utility? Of course, any utilitarian will tell you what he means by utility. There are different theories of utility. Hedonistic theory, preference utilitarianism, which actually I just say is not really a form of utilitarianism at all, but that's another argument. But the libertarians, they don't have it there, or they try to sort of conflate it with their theory of property and justice, so that not having your property interfered with, your justly acquired property interfered with, means you're at liberty. Now, if you try to do that, if you try to build it into a persuasive definition, that's illegitimate anyway, to have a persuasive definition.
Do you mean that a loaded definition, one where you pretty much...
A loaded definition. Yeah. You just say, libertarianism is inherently just, and I'm only defending just property rights, and to be able to do what you like with your just property means that your liberty is being respected. You still haven't explained what liberty is, and the best way to explain what I think the problem is you could have two different piles of property rights, and you can look at one pile of property rights, insofar as you can put property rights in a pile, of course. We're in the sort of Popper's world 3 here, or maybe Plato's. And you can say, well, I can see that those property rights are what I call libertarian, whilst those property rights over there, I don't think libertarian at all, because they include, for instance, slavery and so forth. Now, how do you know that these rights fit liberty and that those rights don't fit liberty? The only way you can know that is if you have a theory of liberty which doesn't include the theory of property, so that you can test it against it. You can say, this is what liberty is, and it's an abstract theory of liberty, just like utility is abstract. As abstract as you can get. It's not. You've got to say something, but you want to take property out of it. You want to take justice and morals out of it, because you don't want liberty to be moral by definition. You don't want to build all your good things into your theory of liberty, because it ought to be in principle possible that the libertarian thing is immoral. You can't say liberty is moral by definition, because if you're going to try that trick, then a socialist can say, well, obviously by socialism I mean is inherently moral, and for me libertarianism is inherently immoral. One of the things philosophy does is it sort of separates things and then looks at them in isolation. Now, I argue that even though we have this fundamental intuition about how property gives you liberty in an intuitive sense, we can say these people are not interfering with each other if they own themselves, if they own these things, and it's productive in an intuitive sense. It's a bit more difficult to say, but rather than just intuitively, what explicit theory of liberty can we come up with to explain what's going on here? And I say you can. The explicit theory of liberty in a slightly longer form is that people have interpersonal liberty to the extent that they are not initiating constraints on each other's preference, satisfaction, or goals. I mean, whatever it is that you're trying to do, if I'm not actively getting in your way, I'm leaving you alone, as it were. This is trying to get at the idea of liberty as sort of leaving each other alone, but without mentioning property. Now, the only way you can get at that idea is to talk about people's want satisfaction or preference satisfaction. If you're not initiating constraints on their preference satisfaction, then you're not interfering with their liberty. Now, this still is a bit counterintuitive, and there's a lot of philosophical argument here. If you're used to just talking about it in terms of, this all sounds a bit vague, perhaps. But you can see that if you have control of your own body, then, and I can't control your body, in some sense, I'm not interfering with you. I'm not proactively imposing on you what you choose to do with your own body. And the same can be extended to external items in the world. So it's possible to see how, I don't want to get into property too quickly here, because I actually say there's a sort of 4-stage or 4-level procedure that you actually need to go through to explain what's going on. There's an abstract theory of liberty. I summarize it as the absence of proactive impositions, but I say that's just another way of saying you're not initiating constraints on people doing or achieving what they want to do or achieve. That's the abstract theory. Once you've got the abstract theory, you then look at the world, what people are like, what their circumstances are, what resources there are, and you can then apply that theory to the world. You say, well, if that is your theory of liberty, that people shouldn't proactively impose constraints on each other, and these constraints have to be relative to what they want. Ultimately, you can't simply be. It's got to be a constraint on nothing. So what's it constraint on? It can't be a constraint on their property. We haven't got to property yet. That comes later. So we can say people have to be able to control their own bodies if liberty is to be respected in the world. They have to be able to control resources that they've acquired without proactively interfering with anybody else. And so we've derived from a theory of what liberty is, abstractly conceived, the practical application. People control themselves, people control certain resources acquired and held in a way that fits the abstract theory of liberty. Now, I haven't mentioned property yet, because if we lived in a world where everybody understood liberty and respected it, or by some kind of weird natural law had no choice but to respect it, we could simply say people control themselves and people control resources. Because we live in a world where it actually is probably a good idea to have law and property, we can say not only should people control themselves and control those resources, we'll make that control of themselves self-ownership. They own themselves and they own these resources. So property comes a stage below that. It's the next stage on. The abstract theory of liberty, the practical implications as regards who has control over what, if you apply that theory in the world, and then the propertization of that, to institutionalizing that control as property rights. Now, so you see, when you approach it this way, property comes quite a long way down. You're about the third stage. You finally reach property. But now you've explained how property, the institution of property, defends abstract liberty in practice. That's what it does. It's a completely separate question whether any of this is a good thing. I've said nothing about just property or moral property or anything else. I'm just saying this is what liberty is. This is what's abstractly, this is what it has to be. People not proactively constraining each other with respect to what they're trying to do. In the world as we find it, where we all occupy one body and we have one life and whatever, people would have to control themselves, control assets that they find, as long as they fit the abstract theory, and then it all gets propertized as a way of protecting that. That would then be a world which had liberty in it. Another issue is the fact, of course, you can't have perfect liberty, but I'll come back to that in a minute, maybe. You then say, okay, where does justice and where does morals come in? And I say, right, if you accept that three-stage sort of derivation of what liberty is and how it all fits together and how property comes out of it, if you're not a justificationist, you simply say, well, why shouldn't you have liberty? I mean, we have an explanation that it gives us liberty, and when I consider my own life, I say, well, I think I quite like having liberty, thank you, and I think most other people have liberty. And we have an explanation that it gives us productivity by solving the tragedy of the commons and allowing people to keep what they produce but not impose externalities on other people. It's very efficient. I say we've got liberty and we've got productivity. What's not to like? What's wrong with it? I would say it's just. What I mean by just is I can't see it really, or moral is I can't see any reason why it isn't just or isn't moral. So I would say to anybody who wanted to criticize you tell me what you think is immoral about it, and I will answer you. Now, often what they'll do is they'll come up with something that I would want to reject, either for empirical reasons or for moral reasons or whatever, but you never know. So it's all, it's a moral conjecture that libertarianism is desirable. It's a moral...
But under liberty, the poor are going to sleep under bridges, Jan. Don't you know that?
Only if they paid. Well, one of the reasons why we have a housing shortage in this country is because they won't allow people just build lots of property and, and in all various sizes. So you could buy maybe a starter pod. You come down to London for the first time, you sleep in a pod, it's got a TV and it's warm, and you pay a tiny pittance, and then slowly you move up to a higher. Instead, they say, no, all property has to come up to a certain standard size, and by creating that standard size, and by the way, you can't build there, no, and you can't build there. So it's got to be a high-ish standard, and then lots of places you're not allowed to build. What this does is then throws people on the streets. They're on the streets because the government, by supposedly trying to keep up the standards, has made those standards too expensive for some people to afford. I say that, but there will always be, I think, in any society, some people who, for one reason or another, fall through the cracks or insist on jumping through the cracks. No, I don't want. No, don't put me in a house. I'm not interested. I choose to live on the street. That's what I've chosen. I say that, though I have read surveys where they show that something like half or more of all beggars actually live outside London in quite nice homes, and they commute in and beg all day, tax-free income. They go home on the train at night with their money. We're not supposed to talk about these things, though occasionally there have been, surveys where they found a lot of these beggars not homeless at all. There are some who genuinely are, of course, but you would think, as the government takes something approaching half of the gross national product every year, they could at least, stop homelessness. They can't even stop homelessness. How can you take half of a country's gross national product every year and there are still people begging in the street? That seems to me that's government failure. But especially given the fact that they've created these bogus standards for property and extreme regulations of how high you can build and where you can build. And so I think I've read that something like only about 2% of the United Kingdom is actually built on, if you include all the roads. You know, people say, oh, no, we're too crowded, It's only 2% has been built on. If you look at, you know, the United Kingdom from a sufficient height, you'll just see green everywhere.
Right.
There's plenty of places you could build on. But then they say, oh, no, national beauty spot or something. No, you can't build there. Well, if you're going to introduce enough regulations, you're going to create, you know, difficulties for people.
But getting back to proactive impositions,
yeah,
a lot of these theoretical scenarios that people go through are typical. A typical one is, what happens if some rich billionaire buys up all these water supplies, or buys up this or that, or buys up all the land surrounding you, and just for fun, because they're so typically sociopathic by virtue of being wealthy, they decide that they're going to cut off your access to any roads to get food, and you'll just eventually die on their land.
Okay, this is a sort of classic objection to extreme property rights. Now, the Rothbardian Blockian line is somewhat different to my own. Block says, when you don't own up to the heavens and down to hell, so therefore people can always dig under, or they can put a bridge over, or whatever. But I think because once you have a theory of liberty, you can simply say that by buying up a piece of land, you can be creating a nuisance which didn't exist before, and therefore you have to allow an easement because of liberty, because liberty trumps property. The only reason we have property is that it instantiates liberty. If you can buy all the land around somebody's house and say, no, you can't cross now, you're just going to sit there and starve, you've obviously created a great imposition with respect to this person. It seems that if liberty is to be respected, we say, no, you've got to be able to allow him to come and go. You can't do that. You're simply you can't use property to restrict liberty when the purpose of the property is there to respect liberty. So I would say he doesn't have to dig underneath. He doesn't have to build a bridge over, or as I think Rothbard says at one point, find a friend with a helicopter. He simply said, no, you can't block people in, because you can't use your land in such a way that you are creating a nuisance to other people. You're thereby creating a negative externality. So absolute property rights are trumped by liberty if there's a clash. But because there's a theory of liberty, you can see how and where you will need to trump them. And it will be really quite rare. It won't happen very often, but very occasionally you will have problem cases. And if you believe in absolute property rights, you've got a problem. Now, this is where I say you can't have perfect liberty. Now, if your fundamental picture is private property and you don't go behind that with any kind of a theory of liberty, you've got the apparent paradox, which has often been pointed out, that if you pollute at all, you seem to be interfering with other people's property rights by pollution. Therefore, no pollution can be allowed. Now, as a criticism, that really only goes halfway. A lot of people look at it that way, but it cuts both ways. If I light a fire and the smoke from my fire interferes with you, maybe giving you asthma or whatever, that's a negative externality. But if we say that that's not allowed and I'm prevented from lighting a fire, then that's a negative externality on me that I can't now have warmth and cooking. So it cuts both ways. Often, as people are in each other's vicinity, there will be a clash. And in those circumstances, you cannot have perfect liberty. All you can do is maximize liberty between anybody who's involved in the clash. So we have to come to an accommodation. In this case, I will pay you to move somewhere else, or maybe you'll pay me, or somewhere whereby the extent to which we're being a nuisance to each other is minimized. In the case of pollution from vehicles, obviously, which is a big thing, if nobody's allowed to drive a vehicle, this is going to be an incredible imposition on people who need vehicles to get to work, to transport food. And so the economy would grind to a halt if we said no vehicles can be allowed because of the pollution interferes with other people's property rights, because they're then forced to breathe it. So we say, yeah, okay, it's true that the pollution that comes out of our vehicles will pollute other people who maybe don't have vehicles. But if they stop us from having vehicles, that's an even bigger imposition on us, because civilization would almost grind to a halt if you said, no, sorry, we've got to go back to horse and carts everywhere, or maybe not even that, because that's not really hygienic, you've just got to have a cart and carry it yourself. So it always cuts both ways. So what are you going to do? In order to minimize the extent to which people are a nuisance to each other, you're going to have to come up with whichever the least constraining rule you can come up with. In this case, like if there are a few Greens who say we're quite happy if there are no cars.
By Greens, you mean environmentalists, correct?
Oh, yeah, extreme environmentalists, the Khmer Vert, as opposed to the Khmer Rouge, who say we're quite happy if we go back to a much more primitive time, we're quite happy with that. Then for this tiny group of misanthropic nuts to constrain everybody else, is for them to be a huge imposition on everybody else. It's much the lesser imposition to say is, why don't you just move to Wales, out North Wales, where nobody lives, and almost none of the pollution will reach you. We know that the pollution drops off very, very rapidly as you move out of the city, and once you're well away from it, tiny particles are now. If the tiny particles may, or the amount of tiny particles may be so small that any damage done is undetectable. If it were detectable, we could say, okay, because you can't live in the city and whatever, maybe you're entitled to a penny compensation or something. But really, if there are so many ways in which everybody gets in each other's way potentially all the time, that we can only come up with a rule that minimizes clashes. But clashes are inevitable, and clashes come in from the very, very start. For instance, if we're talking about controlling yourself and then eventually owning yourself, now it is a bit of a nuisance to me that maybe that somebody's body, I could just cut them up and cook them and eat them, and the fact that I can't do that means that I'm being constrained in what I'd like to achieve, or that just the raw materials that they have to use up in the world in order to keep their body going it constrains me to some small extent, not very much. But then, of course, if we look at it the other way round, if they can't cut me up and eat me, or interfere with my consumption of resources in the world, then at least I get to live. So, if I have to choose a rule, I'm going to choose a rule where, okay, I won't interfere with you, and if you don't interfere with me, that is the rule that constrains us the least.
But isn't that liberty itself?
You choose the specific rule. The specific rule isn't liberty itself. We choose the rule that can, which is the application of liberty. Liberty itself is not initiating constraints on each other. There will be a constraint. I mean, your house might be a constraint on me. I want to get from A to B, and your house is in the way. Should I be able to knock your house down, or just walk through it? Knock the door down and walk through. And
if you huff and puff hard enough, maybe. But
yeah. So the your property will be in my way, but similarly, my property will often be in your way. And I think, well, I won't interfere with your property. I'll put up with the inconvenience of the fact that sometimes your house is going to be in my way, and you will put up with the fact that sometimes my house will be in your way. We minimize that rule, which is not liberty itself, is an instantiation of minimizing or maximizing liberty. You can't have perfect liberty often, because people will just get in each other's way in all sorts of ways the whole time. It can't be helped. That's why you can't have perfect liberty. Even to have property, maybe you find some land or a house before I find it, and if you hadn't found it, I would have found it, and I would have bought the house or whatever. So you're being a nuisance to me, but it's a bigger nuisance to have a rule that you can simply keep asking people to leave because you've arrived. Somebody can then do it to you. A better rule that imposes least is to say, look, once you bought the house, it's yours, and other people can't just take it from you because they beat you to it. But now, that might not always apply with supply of essential natural resources like a water supply in the desert or something, but generally speaking, what private property rights do is they minimize the extent to which there are infractions of liberty rather than give us perfect liberty. And so the proprietarians who think that they give us perfect liberty are wrong, and they tie themselves in knots trying to show that there's no serious sense in which pollution, for instance, interferes with other people. It does interfere with other people, but I say it's the lesser imposition that some pollution be allowed. Obviously, on a certain level, it would be better if it weren't allowed, because now you're interfering with people more than you need to in order to have a functioning society. This is often seen as a sort of utilitarianism of liberty, but it isn't. It's saying, given that you have specific clashes, one person wants this and the other person wants it not to happen, or he wants it for himself, all you can do is come up with a rule that minimizes the extent to which there is a clash. But then that's as good as you can get. You shouldn't pretend that there are no clashes. You shouldn't pretend that there is no invasion of property rights if you pollute. There is an invasion of property rights if you pollute, and but some simply has to be tolerated as the lesser proactive imposition.
But what about the cases where everybody's polluting? That's one rule, is like the estoppel rule, right? You don't get to make a claim against somebody else for polluting you if they're polluting me, right? Or it has to be reciprocal, and a lot of these complaints just fall apart at that level, do they not?
Yeah, of course. If people are all polluting at such a level that you've got a tragedy of the commons, then maybe there is a problem there that property rights would solve. I mean, it could be that we're all worse off because of this pollution, but then better defining the property rights would enable us all to come up with a rule which made us all better off. So maybe we can't all have fires all day long or whatever, but the pollution comes down to an acceptable level so we don't get so ill from having all. In London, back in the 50s, we used to get smogs, which is when the smoke goes into the fog, and it used to kill people. It used to kill lots of people. Then they got rid of all the smoke, and no. But of course, if everybody's got a fire in their house, smoke coming out, you're going to put one in your house because at least you're going to get some warmth. The little bit of smoke that comes from your fire is not going to do you any damage compared to what everybody else has. Now, it might look as though this is where the government had to step in and save us from ourselves, but of course that's wrong. It's quite possible to stop people doing all this pollution within the framework of private law and taking out class actions and so forth, and that would happen.
I've heard arguments like this actually from the people that you are criticizing the most. For instance, Hoppe does argue in very, very similar lines. For first use, but also as the reason you have property is to minimize conflict.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, I often see little hints of what I'm saying crop up here and there as intuitions. Now, it's minimizing conflict, yeah, but that's not as clear as saying maximizing liberty, because I'm a libertarian and I believe in liberty, and I'm trying to get liberty going here. If there's an intuition that conflict infringes liberty. But unless you have an explicit theory of liberty, all you've got is an intuition. So you've got your original intuition that you can see that property solves conflict. You can see that it stops people interfering with each other. But if you never come up with a theory of liberty, you can't really explain how liberty fits into it. And if you can't explain how liberty fits into it, what's going to happen is somebody who has a socialist theory of liberty will tell you his theory of liberty, and if you've got no theory to reply to him with, then you can't beat something with nothing. He's got a theory of liberty, so he can say, no, I'm a libertarian, here's my theory of liberty. All you are is a propertarian. That's all you believe in, property. You say you're a libertarian. Explain to me, where does the liberty come in? A lot of libertarians can't explain. They are actually, in a hole. Now, some of them do have a sort of theory of liberty, but they've chosen the worst kind of theory of liberty. They've chosen Hobbes's theory of liberty, which is more or less you're at liberty if you can do anything you like. So it's not interpersonal liberty where it's simply if you can do it, that's liberty. So there's no distinction between liberty and interfering with people. If I'm at liberty to kill you, then that's a liberty. So they then say, what are we going to do with liberty? Well, we want to have maximum valuable liberties for everybody. Now, once you start talking about maximum valuable liberties for everybody, you're not really talking about liberty at all. What you're saying is we want to have property rights that give us utility. Well, that's fine. You'll probably end up with the same sorts of rules, but what you haven't got there is any clear theory of liberty, interpersonal liberty, as people not initiating constraints upon each other. You have to have that theory clear, otherwise you officially say you're talking about liberty, but really you've just slid into utilitarianism. You say those liberties that give us, which are valuable. In other words, whatever works from a consequentialist point of view, that's not theory of liberty. That's separate. That's got to be kept separate. It's whether something has good consequences is conceptually and theoretically different from what liberty is. Liberty doesn't have good consequences by definition. And if you're going to say, well, we want this liberty with its good consequences, but we'll keep that liberty out because it has bad consequences, well, you're not maximizing liberty, are you? You're just maximizing the good consequences. So you haven't really got a theory of liberty at all. They claim it's a theory of liberty. It's not a theory of liberty at all, except in the Hobbesian senses of you have a liberty. I mean, you're at liberty to do whatever you can get away with. In that sense of liberty, that's not the libertarian sense of liberty, as I understand it. The libertarian sense of liberty is as not interfering with each other, and if some things will constitute not interfering with each other. However you want to unpack that, as I said, there's different ways of doing it, and other things simply are interfering with each other. And it's crazy to say, well, we've restricted the liberty to kill people at whim. Why would you even call that liberty? That's like a sort of really weird way of defining or theorizing the liberty that libertarians are trying to get at. It must be a theory of how of people not interfering with each other in some way. Now, you can go in different directions with that. What kind of interference? What exactly is it that you're not constraining? Now, some people will want to say you've got to bring property, and I think they're wrong. They think you can't have an abstract theory that doesn't bring property in, and then some other people will say, well, you can't have an abstract theory that doesn't bring justice in. I think they're all completely wrong. All of these things are very, very easy to separate, and if you don't separate them, you get paradoxes. And as soon as you see the picture of how they can be separated, abstract theory of liberty, practical consequences, propertization, and then finally, moral defense or normative considerations. How do we defend? Once you've seen that, everything sort of falls into place, and we get out of the horrible mess that we have in mainstream libertarianism now, where I see article after article, year after year, where people keep rediscovering the same problems with libertarianism and trying variations on solutions which are very, very similar to each other, but they're stuck within the same essential conflation where they have something like just property rights and no theory of liberty. And then they want to work out how they get out of the paradoxes that just saying libertarianism is just property rights, without being able to explain anything about what liberty is or how it relates to them, and that these property rights are inherently just, and there are these rights and not those rights, but we can't tell you how. And they try on different things. They say, well, can it be done with self-ownership on its own? Or maybe we have to reject self-ownership and do it some other way. And I see them going round and round and round in circles because they will not do this thing that philosophy allows you to do and more or less insists that you do, insofar as it can insist, an abstract subject can insist on anything. But the whole purpose of philosophy is separating things to avoid confusion. As soon as you do that, as soon as you separate moral issues, justice, from the property, from the abstract theory, you can then see how the pieces fit together. Bundle them all up, you've got a mess, and there's no way out of that mess. They keep sort of trying to pull theories in or throw a bit of theory out and seeing if they can make it all consistent and solve the problems. They can't do it. I mean, I've replied to quite a lot of these things, but ultimately, people need to criticize the alternative, which I'm offering, rather than I simply keep criticizing them. I don't know how I can persuade people to do that. Maybe this will help. maybe some people will now think, all I really ask for is that people do criticize this theory. I'm not asking people to agree with me. I say, please refute me. Refute this theory. If I'm completely mistaken, if it's not possible to separate abstract theory from the practical consequences, from the propertization, from the moral issues, if those separations are not possible, and I've tried to do something that you really can't do, show me that that's impossible, and then of course that would be an advance in theory. So we've learned that isn't possible. If it's possible to show that this is all a mistake. I'm not looking to get people to agree with me. I just like them to engage with this alternative theory of libertarianism from a philosophical point of view. Obviously, I more or less go along with the economics and the history and so forth, game theory. Who knows what you might use to defend libertarianism with? I'm just talking about fundamental philosophical theory. I have a fundamental, which is, I have to admit, is so different that as far as I can see, it flummoxes people. Even philosophers. Well, many philosophers they actually tell me they can't get past the idea that we're not trying to provide supporting justifications for libertarianism. They can't get that, so they just can't get past the epistemology. Forget all the rest, the theory of liberty and how you then can deduce everything. They can't get past that bit. Different people have different sticking points, but it is so different, and that's why I started calling it a new paradigm. Because at first I just thought, oh, I'm tweaking it here and there, and now I've made sense of it. And I said, no, I haven't just tweaked it. What I produced here is something really so radically different that people can't even understand it, I'm afraid. However, part of the reason they can't understand it is they won't engage with it. They dismiss it out of hand. They find it so weird. For them, it is axiomatic that libertarianism is what Rothbard says or what Nozick says. And this is often true of critics as well. People, they write their chapter in their books explaining political philosophy, and the entirety of the chapter on libertarianism is a refutation of Nozick. Maybe Rothbard gets in a footnote. That's it. So that's libertarianism refuted as far as they're concerned. But I can forgive people who are outside libertarianism. But when people are inside, you'd think they'd want to be a bit more open to different theories and considering them and so forth. But I find that's not the way they want to go. Just a few weeks ago, I was reading yet another article where somebody is trying to fix mainstream libertarianism, as I call it, from within. Everybody thinks that just this little tweak here or a little tweak there, and you can do it. It's hopeless. I won't name the article. It could be any number of articles because they all more or less do the same thing. They will not distinguish. Well, they have no what I call an eleutherology. They have no theory of liberty, from eleutheria, the Greek word for liberty and the goddess of liberty. So like epistemology. They have no theory of liberty at all. Then they say something like, fundamental to libertarianism is self-ownership. They don't explain what this has got to do with liberty. You're just supposed to swallow that. And then after that, after you've got self-ownership, well then, just property. Well, just property. What about libertarian property? Is just property libertarian property? How do we know? Isn't it in principle possible that libertarian property could be unjust? Anyway, they're all so stuck within this system that every time they do something which they think is radical and maybe a solution, it's simply rejecting a part of the mess where everything is fused together As I said, everything is fused together except for liberty, which doesn't get a look in. Liberty isn't mentioned, or it's mentioned in this crazy way where liberty means you can do what you like. So let's just choose the good examples of doing what you like and keep those. Well, that's not a theory of liberty. I'm sorry, that's no serious theory of liberty there at all. So they've got no theory of liberty and then a conflated mess of everything else. They've got to leave this behind, and then they will solve the philosophical problems. Now, you don't have to solve philosophical problems, but it helps. Because if you don't solve your philosophical problems, you will have philosophical critics who will reject what you have to say because they can't make any sense of it. They want to make sense of it. I mean, people who are not libertarians will sometimes say, I have this theory of liberty. How does liberty fit in with yours? If you've got nothing to say, how can you convince them? You can get away with a certain amount of redneck proprietarianism. Just like, I believe in property rights, and that's what we need. Don't steal, and taxation is theft. Shut up. That's it. That will take you a long way. But there's one group of people that we have to convince, that it's absolutely crucial that we convince, and there are two ways of convincing them. I have a pincer movement by which I hope to get them within these pincers and make them squeal. Now, one half of the pincer movement is this making these intellectual distinctions and being able to answer them and being able to show what liberty has to do with property and why libertarians do really believe in liberty, making all these distinctions and not falling into justificationist incoherence and so forth. Second aspect is we've got to get the state or government, as you would say in the US, out of politics. At the moment, the university and degree system is a monopoly maintained by aggressive coercion and to a considerable extent funded by taxation. And what this means is that almost all of the intellectuals get their privilege and money from the state. This affects the theories that they come up with. It attracts people who, go along with that, for one thing, but also it corrupts them when they're on the inside. That's why whenever you look at universities, you find some of what you in America would call the most liberal views coming out of the universities, because they're part of the state. These people, they haven't really got jobs. They don't pay taxes, a lot of them. It depends on the university and where they are. They don't pay taxes in the sense that if they're getting more money from taxation than they're really paying out in tax, they're not really paying taxes. They're just living off the other people's taxes while pursuing their hobbies or their hobby horses, political hobby horses. The best way to get this is to say anybody can call themselves a university and award degrees, no money. It's crazy to think that at a tertiary level, the state has got to provide universities, because it's an essential need. How can that be an essential need? I can see how they might say they're mistaken, but they might say it, well, we've got to give people a certain amount of education so they can get on in life. They actually destroy their education by giving it to them, but that's another matter. But the tertiary level, there's absolutely no excuse for the state to be involved. If the state simply were to get out of the way and the whole system were to be depoliticized, overnight, virtually, you would see people who were academics start coming out with pro-market arguments instead, and pro-libertarian arguments instead of their current, as I say, what you would call liberal views in America. In other words, the bias in favour of the state would change to a bias in favour of the market, which they would think is terrible, but I said the bias in favour of the state is bias in favour of aggressive coercion, and a bias in favour of the market is a bias in favour of voluntary cooperation and productivity. So we want that bias. It's good that we could have it. So simply withdraw all the legislation that says who can call themselves a university or award degrees and stop all state funding. That would mean that we'll get the intellectuals on our side, and we have to have the intellectuals on our side because they ultimately have more influence than anybody else. Okay. Thank you very much, gentlemen.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.